Michael's getting that up, I'll start. First, thank you, Bob and Michael, for allowing me to contribute to the book and participate in today's presentation. I think the title actually of my chapter might be a bit of a misnomer in an investor's perspective. I will tell you that I invested in agriculture once, and after I had to explain to my wife why we would never see the money again, I've limited myself to helping other people lose money in agriculture. The chapter, though, was written basically from experience of analyzing agriculture every day and doing a bit of due diligence work for investors. And I think, as Michael said, they are a finicky bunch. Uh, this is I've been trying to run this down ever since I heard this back in the 80s that in the 1970 bull market, Shell Oil actually got into agriculture, and when the market went bust, they got out. Derek and I turned out we at least were around a fellow that was an investor, a land grabber, and we're on the risk management side. And it seemed as though no matter how much I tried to explain to him the risks, he was all gung-ho and enthusiastic about investing. And now Derek told me today that no, he's gotten out of it. So they are finicky for a reason. Now, I'm probably going to disappoint Michael. I'm not going to actually go through the chapter that I contributed in the book. I'm hoping that you'll buy the book and see what I said. And I'm going to try a slightly different tack. I'm going to try to step back and say, well, what do I see is going on? What is the real problem? And why I think investment is important. First, I'll start out. Derek talked about the long history, and there's also been a long history of pushing back against foreign investment in agriculture, including here in the United States. Oftentimes, it was against people who are culturally different than us, so that certainly continues to be the case to some degree. I'm surprised there isn't more pushback now about foreign investment in U.S. agriculture, sort of. It's not very much, and then second, it's mostly by Canadians, and second by Brits, so I guess they're culturally close enough that it's okay. Investment tends to come and go with the market, and this is just data showing investment back during the last bear market that we experienced. And you can see that basically on the production side globally, we had less than $100 million a year in investment in production agriculture, about 10 times as much on the processing side. But the thing to keep in mind is if I were to put up essentially the investment on the manufacturing side, it would swamp anything in food and agriculture. It has not been a very preferred area for people to put their money. And I can tell you that from having lived through those bear markets, in fact, the last 5 years and then maybe a couple of years in the 2000s, most of my career has been one of relatively very low, stable prices. And the downside of that is that we could not attract capital. We could not attract talent. In fact, most of the people I know, they went into information technology or investment banking, whatever. Agriculture was not seen as very sexy. Derek mentioned scale, and I want to talk about scale because it's something that I feel very strongly about. And I think if we just talk about land grab, we may miss the forest for the trees. I was struck back in 2003. There was a WTO ministerial in Cancun, and some activists opposed to it took the media to this small Mexican farmer's place, and he was standing there, and he had his hut, and his kids were crunched down on the dirt floor of their little abode, and the activists were saying, the WTO is going to ruin this man's way of life. And I thought, this man's way of life? I mean, what a waste of human talent. We have people that are basically bending down, stooping down in manual labor in the hot sun when machinery can do this very readily in a fraction of the time, producing 3 and 4 times the yield. It's why we're not getting this poor man out of this oppressive regime. But there's been a long history of rejecting change. We had the 1830s in which the first automated wheat milling equipment came about, and like the Luddites, the The hand thrashers of the time, they basically tried to destroy the machinery, so this is not new. I think the concern that I have is that if we look at historically, this emphasis on small local, like we have right now from the on down, uh, small and local has tended to emphasize tribalism, and along with tribalism, we tend to get conflict. So I'm not sure it's what I would emphasize. And I would say, as a small business person, that I don't want to succeed because the government propped me up. I don't want to succeed because my customers have sympathy for me. I'd rather work to deliver value that I think will have a more sustainable basis for my business. So uh, I think the small is a kind of a misstep there. Um, Michael mentioned, we started on this several years ago. All of the global multilateral institutions have been working hard on this land grab issue for many years now, and they've done so much work on whether it's best practices, performance standards, community rights, all the things that get boxed up as responsible foreign direct investment, and that's all fine. I think on the transparency side, a lot of progress has been made. Michael cited these statistics, so clearly a lot of tracking is going on. Uh, but again, I want to show you a slightly different vision of this. Now, I don't think many countries can or would want to do things the way China is doing it, but it's very instructive. China realized that it could not feed its people if it continued to do it the way they did in the Mao era of basically subsistence agriculture. And so their policy has been, we're going to move 30 million people every year from the rural areas to the cities in order to basically expand their capacity for scale production. Recently, they said they have 111,000 agribusinesses with about $1 trillion in sales value. Their goal over the next 3 to 5 years is to consolidate that down to about half as many companies with $1.6 billion in average annual sales. Uh, China's not alone. Brazil, it's not quite as overt as China, but Brazil has certainly encouraged large-scale production and what we call world beater agribusiness companies, some that own quite a bit of assets here in the United States. If This is somewhat dated data from USDA, but several years ago they calculated that 35,000 farms in the United States produce over half of the commercially traded agricultural production in the United States. More recently, I've heard 300,000 farmers in the U.S. produce 90% of all commercial production. So, I think the point is that we do not need 2.6 billion people in the world in agriculture. If we were to take the same metric as in the United States, we'd only need 8.6 million. So we have a great deal of excess labor in agriculture. And I think the point I'm going to make is that this whole land grab is a symptom of a policy construct in which we use an economic sector, agriculture, to basically try and mitigate a social problem of not knowing what to do with all this excess labor. And capital is simply flowing to this, dystopic situation, or whatever you want to call it. It's easy to blame investors, but really it gets back to poor governance in many, many ways. I'm going to provide now several different views. I'm going to overlay various attributes on one single axis, which is going to be the amount of arable hectares per farmer, because I'm going to show that basically what are the impacts of small-scale agriculture in many ways, and doing it in a relatively inefficient way. Now I'm going to do this, I'm going to use linearity to kind of regress out some of the anomalies, and that you can pick fault with that, and some will say, well, correlation is not causality, but you're going to see it. There's going to be a pattern here, and it's hard to push aside. First, all this admonishment of investors, but tell you the truth, if we look here, I went too far ahead. Here we go. Poor governance. I wasn't paying attention. Um, this is simply taking Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and sure enough, by the way, the higher score is a better score. So what happens is there's less perceived corruption the larger the farm size. Countries with lots of small farms tend to have more corruption problems, more governance. And I would say that really, if we had good governance, then we would have countries like Mozambique and Sudan. They would have rationalized their agriculture sectors a long time ago. They'd be producing at scale. They'd be supplying United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, or whatever, and these countries wouldn't feel so insecure. But instead, they have every right to feel rather concerned when there's only a handful of countries that are really producing agriculture in an efficient fashion. I would also say that if the WTO had the same kinds of requirements on agricultural exports as they do on agricultural imports, in other words, if countries like Ukraine, Russia couldn't suddenly stop exports because they wanted to make sure they protected their own market, then net importing countries wouldn't feel so at risk with what's going on. If your taste is more to the right, this is the Economic Freedom Index, and essentially shows the same thing. Here, a lower score on the Economic Freedom rank is better, and so countries with larger farms tend to have more economic freedom. This is looking at income, and this is national income, so this is GDP per capita by country, and sure enough, you can see that if you allow your farms to consolidate, the nation as a whole tends to do better. It frees up more income to be used for other purposes. Hunger. There is a correlation between small farms and hunger, and we went through that with China's past and in many other ways. And of course, there's all kinds of things that go along with this. It's not just more hunger, it's less education, less health care. There are all kinds of adverse impacts when you have a country that's largely trying to do things in a too small of a fashion. And if we talk about investment, where most investment goes? Where does most investment go? It goes to the countries that just happen to do things that recognize economic principles like economies of scale. I think there's somewhere in the chapter about the impact on environment. This is simply overlaying the Yale's environmental index, and again, countries that have larger farms tend to do better from a standpoint of protecting the environment. And the reason is pretty clear. There's the capital to do so. There's the reputational risk that compels larger operations to do that. Whereas oftentimes, and I can point out several examples in U.S. policy where small farms are exempt. They're not held to the same standard because, again, it's viewed that they don't have the capital to do this. I will conclude here by simply saying the point is that we spent years trying to hold investors accountable, and I think that's important, but it's also important that we hold the politicians accountable in these countries, which basically create the circumstances in which, as Derek pointed out, there is essentially an abuse and corruption of the system. I will say that if these countries do not rationalize their agriculture, this is what U.S. agriculture is headed towards, and Australia and Brazil and everywhere else. Huge investment going in technology and production capacity. And if we look at I'm not worried, by the way, Michael, if we look at the OECD and their forecast, the total factor productivity is forecast to grow at almost 2%, which they predict is ample enough to increase production by 70% by 2050. So we're going to produce enough food. It's a matter of which countries are going to produce it, and unless these poorer countries get their act together, they will not be a part of the profit of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary.